Homage to the Triple Gem. So hello everybody, this is Bhante Joe here, and still here at Gendagala Aranya, maybe about another week and a half left till second Vasa is finished. And I've just been chatting recently a little bit about right view and the importance of right view, but also the dangers of overemphasizing right view. So right view is the forerunner, basically, of it's the chief of the qualities that circle around in the Noble Eightfold Path. Each of the qualities in the Noble Eightfold Path, you develop them basically with right view, with right effort, with right mindfulness. But right view is the chief because it identifies the wrong version of that aspect of the path and differentiates it from the right version. So what this can seem like sometimes is that we should spend a whole lot of time studying, theorizing, and talking to get the right view about what the way forward is in practice. But that is only effective to a certain extent. One of the better ways to think about practice, instead of thinking of it like a kind of Google map or some kind of totally mapped out terrain, which you can choose your route through every tree, every bend, and know every ford in the river, one has to think of it a little bit more like a boxing match, or a little bit more like the times of the earliest explorers when they would step into a completely unknown wilderness and have to find their way through, only knowing the general direction in which they would go. So right view is there to set the general direction. Okay, the place that I'm trying to go is north, or the place that I'm trying to go is west. I know I have a vast wilderness. But another very important aspect of right view, which is one of the reasons why it could be seen to circle around the different elements of the path, is that it chooses the right steps as one goes along the path. Not just before one gets on the path, as one is going along. One evaluates, in terms of one's actions, did they give a good result or did they give a bad result? So to do this, one actually has to have an attitude of experimentation. It doesn't mean that we start with like laying a huge foundation of right view so that every aspect of our practice is clearly predefined with right view. It means that we actually learn as we go along what's a skillful way to operate and what's not a skillful way to operate. One of the interesting things about the Buddha's teachings, the Buddha being the foremost teacher, was that he didn't lay out a very particular technique-based path to Nibbana. What he laid out for us were principles. He laid out a path, the Noble Eightfold Path. When we look at that path, it has many different ways in which it can be approached. I mean, it's always the Noble Eightfold Path, but for each individual, they may develop it in different ways. So the Buddha says that some people first they develop calm, then insight. Some people first develop insight, then calm. Some people develop them stepwise, and some people are just confused. And then their mind opens up. They have an opening, and they realize something significant. So when we step into the wilderness, we don't know what the wilderness of our mind will be like beforehand. We don't get to necessarily choose that I'm going to be this type of person who is going to develop calm first. And I'll develop calm first, then I'll develop insight. Or I'm going to be this type of person who's going to just develop insight first, then develop calm later. It depends on the landscape of our mind, and that landscape will not be fully known to us until we actually start to traverse it. So one of the fundamental aspects of right view is this view, that every aspect of our practice cannot be pre-known and pre-planned beforehand. And then the other important aspect of right view, another very important aspect of right view as we go along, is the ability to evaluate whether or not the actions that we're undertaking give the results that we expect. Now, traversing the wilderness of the mind here, the wilderness is not just dark, it's not just covered, it has its dangers. And a person has to know how to avoid those dangers or have to overcome the dangers. And the dangers here are the kilesas in our mind. They're the greed, they're the hatred, they're the aversion in our mind. And like living dangers in the forest, these dangers almost have a mind of their own. We can't think of them like they're mechanical forces like the pistons in a steam engine or the gears in a car that we can just change at will and pre-plan how we're going to fix them if scenario A, scenario B, or scenario C comes up. It's better to think of them like a living opponent, as if one is in a boxing match. In a boxing match, a living opponent learns from the throws, from the punches that you throw. And if you keep throwing the same punch, eventually it becomes ineffective. So a skilled warrior takes the fundamentals of the technique and trains in the fundamentals of the technique. They train in the fundamentals of how to punch. They train in the fundamentals of how to throw hooks. They train in some of the fundamentals of how to build cardio. These kind of drills that are that are things that are possible to manipulate on, say, like a less creative level, that are things that are possible to pre-plan to a certain extent, even those you can't totally pre-plan. But as a person becomes more and more skilled of a fighter, those very basic and stiff techniques that they learned have to be replaced by creativity to do what's effective to defeat the opponent in the heat of the moment. So I remember as a young man, I used to take Taekwondo. And when you start with Taekwondo, I'll just demonstrate something. You start like doing a block like this, like your hands are way up in the air, and then you block in this very formal way where you turn your hand by your side and you're blocking like this. And it takes a long time. If you had to block a kick or a punch that way, people would see it coming a mile away. But you start this way so you get a good sense of how to hold your hands and how to hold your body and how to move your hips. Moving your hips in a particular way can greatly increase the strength with which you strike or with which you block in martial arts. But as time went on, I eventually got to a point where I was going to go for my black belt test. And I remember one of the new teachers came and we were talking, and he was, as you move along in this kind of training system, the very formal punches, kicks, and forms, they get replaced so that a block that was once way up in the air like this and then, coming down like this, so you can see it a minute in advance, it just becomes this, or something like this, or like this. It's something very, very quick, but all of the fundamentals are still there. The movement of the hip to accentuate the strength, the surface that you strike the person's arm or leg with, the fundamentals that you learn in the form are there. But they're adapted to the heat of the moment, to the heat of the strike. So right view in this case, it becomes something that can be much less intellectual. A right view in certain instances isn't necessarily like a gross and formed thought or philosophy that forms in the mind. It can be a very quick impulse. So right view needs to develop as one progresses along the path. So one's ideas about what it means to have a right view and how to apply it also have to develop in line. So we need to learn to think of our minds this way in order to train them properly. In order to traverse the wilderness of the mind, we can't think of it as something that we can pre-plan. The early explorers, when they set out, they had a compass. They didn't have a GPS. They didn't have Google Maps. They couldn't look every step in the way in advance. But they knew the fundamentals of how to explore. They knew the fundamentals of how to travel. And they also knew how to map. They knew how to map where they'd been so that they could go back there again. And they could learn from where they'd been. They could learn from their terrain. So the Buddha, when he teaches us, he gives us skills like this because every person's mind is different. The wilderness in every person's mind is different. But if we can learn the skills of a warrior, the skills of an explorer, then our right view will become more and more sometimes like the blocks, the punches, the kicks that we do when we become more advanced in martial arts. And it can be, the actual categorical terms in the canon. One can say that one's responses, one can just meld it all into a response. They can become more and more instinctual. And that's what's required to defeat defilements that become more and more subtle. So the Buddha's skill as a foremost teacher wasn't a skill in laying out a path in all of its details. It was a skill in laying out the details that we need, that everybody can use, in laying out the details that that everybody could do, but also in teaching a skill, a path of skill, so that a person could learn to master their own mind, so that they could defeat the opponents in there, and so that they could emerge victorious in the match, emerge victorious from the wilderness and onto safe ground.